So far this season has been the return of the running back in fantasy football, and let's give all the glory to the position. Hey, I'm old, I'm a dinosaur, so you know that I love all this. With that said, we are sending Tyrone, Tracy Jr., Chuba Hubbard, and Jonathan Brooks to Germany to give our German friends something worth watching if we're going to force them to watch the Giants, Panthers, and yes, Machine Gun Kelly. With the Green Bay Packers, Las Vegas Raiders, Seattle Seahawks, and the Cleveland Browns all on bye this week, managers are going to be looking to replace that fantasy production vacated by Josh Jacobs and Kenneth Walker, and we are here to give you those Week 10 starts and sits at the running back position. These backs, they may not change the world, but they may change the world for one fantasy manager, and that's all that matters. So here we go with those Week 10 fantasy football booms, starting with the aforementioned Tyrone, Tracy Jr. as they take on the Carolina Panthers in Munich, Germany. It is safe to say that Tracy, he is now the lead back in New York. While Tracy had just 66 rushing yards in Week 9, he did account for 17 touches out of that Giants backfield. Over the last 3 games in which Devin Singletary has been back, Tracy is averaging 12.3 fantasy points per game and accounted for a 65% snap share along with a 57% opportunity share. Last week, Tracy outsnapped Singletary 47-18. Yeah, I think the change is in full effect. Looking at the last 4 games, Tracy has posted more than 22 fantasy points in half of those contests, which looks like an incoming repeat performance this week because the Carolina Panthers have allowed more than 31 fantasy points per game over the last 4 weeks, and on the season, that number is 31 fantasy points per game. During the previous 4 weeks, Carolina has surrendered 7 rushing touchdowns, 1 receiving touchdown, and 631 total yards to opposing backs. If you're getting that kind of volume, you have yourself a solid RB2. Further, volume and opportunity are what we are seeking for in fantasy. And not only does the snap share favor the rookie, but 100%, yes, 100% of the red zone opportunities have gone to him in the last 2 weeks. We've also seen those weighted opportunities go from 56% 3 weeks ago to 79% last week. The second running back I'm firing up this week is DeAndre Swift of the Chicago Bears as they take on the New England Patriots. Since week 4, only Derrick Henry, Bijan Robinson, Kenneth Walker III, and Alvin Kamara have produced more fantasy points than the 104.5 that Swift has over that period. Only Henry and Joe Mixon have averaged more fantasy points per game than Swift's 20.6 over the last 6 weeks. Of the Bears' 286 yards last week, Swift accounted for 28.7% of that yardage. And before last week, Swift, he was on a bit of a heater there, popping off 4 straight games with 115 yards from scrimmage, falling just 1 game short of David Montgomery's run back in 2020-2021 when he had 5 such games in a row. Swift has averaged 1.83 yards before contact per attempt this season while forcing 19 missed tackles. That is the 14th most, with a 54.7% of his yards coming after contact this season. This week, bring those metrics into this contest against the New England Patriots team. A Patriots team that has allowed a league-worst 640 rushing yards over the last 4 weeks, while allowing the second most rushing touchdowns to running backs and 31.23 fantasy points per game. Let's keep the good times rolling. Let's talk about Aaron Jones of the Minnesota Vikings as they take on the Jacksonville Jaguars. Carolina, they have a bad run defense. The New England Patriots, a terrible run defense. Do you know who else has a bad run defense? How about the Jacksonville Jaguars, who are allowing 26.8 fantasy points per game to the position over the last 4 weeks? Jacksonville, they've also allowed 1,265 total yards and 12 touchdowns to opposing backs this season, leading to the 3rd worst fantasy points allowed. 2 things really stick out in my mind. First, Jones is averaging 4.52 yards per carry this season. He's also averaging 2.94 yards per carry after contact, which has accounted for 65% of his rushing total. After watching Saquon Barkley run over defenders and hurl dudes backwards, I have no faith in this Jaguars defense to be able to stop anybody, let alone Aaron Jones. Second, the Jaguars, they have allowed 55 receptions and 441 receiving yards to backs this season. It is worth noting that in Week 9, Jones' route participation rate of 70% trailed only Devin Chan. Now, that's going to mean we're going to see a lot of Aaron Jones in the passing game, and I'm unsure what the receiving prop is going to be, but I'm going to take the over on that. Now for some running backs I'm not going to take the over on. Here are the Week 10 fantasy football busts, and I'm going to start with Rico Dowdle, the Dallas Cowboys, taking on the Philadelphia Eagles. If you watch this show, if you read my work, if you're on the Discord channel, you know the answer is never Rico Dowdle. Now, I'm here to protect you from yourselves. Ezekiel Elliott last week was disciplined and not allowed to travel with the team because apparently he can't make team meetings. Now, the Dallas Cowboys, they decided to give Dalvin Cook a couple touches and realized, hey, that's a pretty bad idea. Now, Dowdle, let's give the man a little bit of credit here. He busted off 6.3 yards per carry on average there, and on his way to a respectable 75 rushing yards. He also added 32 yards in the passing game on 5 receptions. That's all great. We got some good fantasy production. Now, the bad, Dak Prescott, he is out for multiple weeks with a hamstring injury. CeeDee Lamb, he's also considered week to week with that AC joint shoulder injury. Volume, it may be there, but so too are the Philadelphia Eagles, who have allowed just 16.13 fantasy points per game, the third fewest over the last 4 weeks. In 4 weeks, the Eagles have allowed just 274 total yards to backs and just 1 rushing touchdown. If my childhood taught me anything, it's you don't go chasing waterfalls, and you sure as heck don't go chasing fantasy points. Next up, how about Tony Pollard against the Los Angeles Chargers? Every single week, it feels like I'm talking about Tony Pollard as either a must start or a must sit. There is no even medium for the Titans running back. Last week, he took advantage of a great matchup against the Patriots, 31 touches, 154 yards. Who needs practice? Now, I want to start Pollard. I really do. We know the volume is there. 2.88 yards after contact per attempt. 18 forced tackles. 142 attempts this season. An average of 4.38 yards per carry. But just when I start believing once again, a difficult matchup presents itself. The matchup this week, it's the Los Angeles Chargers, a defense that has allowed the second fewest fantasy points to opposing backs. A defense that is allowing just 16.76 per game and just 110 total yards to the position per game. Los Angeles, they've also allowed only 2 total touchdowns all season long. And so I guess if you need a flex option or an RB3, then hey, you can make a case for Tony Pollard to be in your starting lineup. But you should also make sure there's a contingency plan put in place there. Make sure you have someone with some upside locked and loaded and ready to go. And finally, the third running back that I'm seeing this week, it is Rhamondre Stevenson of the New England Patriots at the Chicago Bears. There's a good chance that the Rhamondre Stevenson resurgence is a direct result of being on my weekly sit list. Back in week 8, Stevenson was on my sit list, yet somehow he managed 22 fantasy points against the New York Jets thanks to a pair of touchdowns. It certainly had nothing to do with the 2.4 yards per carry in that game. Last week, back on the sit list, back with another pair of touchdowns, and back with 21 fantasy points despite just 1.6 yards per carry. That is not sustainable. I don't care who you are. I'm going to follow the metrics here. I'm not going to chase those fantasy points. Once again, the matchup, it is not good. The Chicago Bears over the last 4 weeks have allowed just 1 rushing score and 337 total yards over that span. It is certainly hard to argue with the 7 touchdowns that Stevenson has produced this season, especially when 5 of them have come over the last 4 games. But that kind of pace, that kind of production, it is hard to maintain unless you are Derrick Henry. Now, I would bet that touchdown regression is on its way. It's going to come sooner than another Stevenson touchdown. Now, one other matchup here that is difficult on paper, but one I am definitely not worried about is Devin Achane of the Miami Dolphins as they face the Los Angeles Rams on Monday Night Football. The Rams, they are allowing the 5th fewest fantasy points to running backs over the last 4 weeks. Don't care. Achane, he is built differently, especially with Tua Tagovailoa. He's essentially matchup proof. In games in which Tagovailoa has been under center, the Dolphins back averages 27.6 fantasy points. Even if you zero out all his rushing totals for fantasy, he is averaging 17.8 fantasy points per game. As a receiver, that would make him the wide receiver 8 between Malik Neighbors and Garrett Wilson, and that is a good thing. Now, if you're looking for another good thing, head over to RotoBaller.com for all the latest fantasy football news and analysis, and check out the RotoBaller Discord channel where you'll find me there answering all your questions 24/7. See you next week.